Hi, my name is Alex. Of all the battlefields a teenager can navigate, the clamorous cafeterias, the shifting alliances of friendship, the treacherous terrain of first loves, none is quite as confounding as the classroom of a teacher who has decided, for reasons opaque and immutable, that you are the enemy. For me, that battlefield was Mrs. Thorne's ninth-grade honors English class, a room that always smelled faintly of dust and disappointment. I was 15, a kid for whom school had always been a relatively easy game. I knew the rules. Pay intermittent attention, do the homework most of the time, be reasonably respectful, and success would follow. Teachers tended to like me, even when my innate laziness frustrated them. They saw a spark they wished would ignite into a steady flame. But Mrs. Thorne was different. She didn't see a spark. She saw a nuisance. The foundation of her disdain, I quickly deduced, was my identity as an athlete. I played 3 sports: football in the fall, basketball in the winter, soccer in the spring. A trifecta of extracurricular commitment that she viewed as a personal affront. Her grievance wasn't with me, per se, but with the entire concept of student athletes, a breed she considered privileged and academically unserious. We were the ones who missed her sacred lectures on iambic pentameter for long bus rides to distant towns, who traded the analysis of Shakespearean sonnets for the execution of zone defenses. What she willfully ignored was that my absences were not solely for sports. I was also our school's representative for math olympiads, science fairs, and quiz bowl tournaments, my brain as mobile as my body. But in her eyes, the jersey I wore to games on Fridays was a scarlet letter, marking me as a member of a tribe she held in contempt. Her prejudice was not a subtle, unspoken thing. It was a policy enacted with bureaucratic cruelty. She had a particular knack for scheduling, or more accurately, weaponizing homework. It became a predictable pattern. After a long away game, particularly on a weeknight when we wouldn't return until late, the following day's homework load would mysteriously double. A simple reading assignment would balloon into a reading assignment plus a response journal plus a set of analytical questions. And the true genius of her system was its selective enforcement. Mrs. Thorne was not a teacher who checked homework with the robotic consistency of a drill sergeant. She might let it slide for 3 days in a row, lulling us into a false sense of security. But she always checked the day after an away game. It was a trap, meticulously set and sprung with a quiet, smug satisfaction as she moved down the row of athletes, her pen ticking off the incomplete assignments in her gradebook, a silent indictment of our divided loyalties. This systemic bias was frustrating, but it was the more personal, pedagogical injustice that truly rankled. I was a competent writer, a fact acknowledged by every other English teacher I'd ever had. In Mrs. Thorne's class, however, my papers would return with scores in the 70s or low 80s, the pages bizarrely pristine, devoid of the red ink that served as a roadmap for improvement. I'd look at the essays of my peers, their margins littered with corrections, suggestions, and questions, and see grades in the 90s. It was a confusing dichotomy. Were my papers so perfect they needed no commentary, yet so fundamentally flawed they deserved a C? The cognitive dissonance was maddening. The breaking point on this front came with a personal narrative assignment. I had written about my grandfather teaching me how to identify constellations on a cold, clear night at our family's lake house. I had poured myself into it, carefully crafting metaphors about connecting the dots in the sky mirroring the connecting of generations. I was proud of it. Came back with an 82. The page was blank, save for the numbers circled at the top. Something in me snapped. After class, I approached her desk, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. "Mrs. Thorne," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "I was hoping you could give me some feedback on my essay. There aren't any comments, and I'd like to know how to improve." She looked up from her desk, her eyes cool and appraising behind her glasses. "You're capable of better," she said simply. "I understand that," I pressed. "But specifically, what was wrong with it? How is it an 82? She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "I grade on a scale of ultimate capability. You are currently operating at about 70% of yours. The students who received A's are operating at 90% of theirs. Therefore, the grade reflects your effort relative to your potential. The sheer audacity of this grating philosophy left me momentarily speechless. It was entirely subjective, a movable goalpost designed to keep me perpetually in the red zone. I found my voice, sharp with disbelief. So, let me get this straight. Does that mean my paper, as it is written, could be objectively better than someone else's, but I could receive a score 20 points lower? She didn't even blink. Yes. In that moment, any lingering respect I had for her evaporated. This wasn't pedagogy. It was punishment. The most bizarre postscript to this incident was that later that same year, it was Mrs. Thorne who recommended me for an advanced composition class, a course typically reserved for juniors and seniors. The recommendation felt less like an endorsement and more like a confirmation of her twisted logic. She knew I was capable, which meant, in her world, she was justified in penalizing me for not constantly performing at that peak. It was a maddening, no-win situation. The grand crescendo of our conflict arrived in the final weeks of the school year, wrapped in the guise of an extra credit opportunity. She announced that we could earn a significant bonus by attending a local college's production of Antigone, writing a 2,500-word paper connecting the performance to our class discussions on the play, and turning in the ticket stub and playbill as proof. The catch: it was due on a Monday, and the play was only showing Friday through Sunday. There was no turning it in early. This presented an immediate problem. That Monday, I was scheduled to be absent all day for the state-level academic decathlon, the culmination of a year's worth of competitions. To even qualify, I had to place in the top 10 at a regional event. This was a major academic honor for the school, a fully excused absence that I had documented weeks in advance. For an entire week leading up to the play, I reminded Mrs. Thorne of my conflict. Each time, her response was the same: just turn it in first thing Tuesday morning. It won't be a problem. She told me this on Tuesday, Wednesday, and twice on Thursday. The instruction was unambiguous. So I executed the plan. My Friday was a whirlwind. School, then basketball practice, then a frantic rush home where my patient mother waited to drive me back across town, still damp from the shower, to make the curtain call for Antigone. I watched the tragedy unfold, took notes, and spent most of Saturday drafting and polishing the paper, ensuring it was thorough and insightful. On Monday, I competed, my mind focused on logic puzzles and historical facts, and I succeeded, placing first in one category and second in another. I returned home that evening, triumphant and exhausted, my backpack containing the completed, printed essay, the ticket stub, and the playbill, ready for its Tuesday morning submission. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen and before my 7 a.m. basketball workout, I went directly to Mrs. Thorne's classroom. The halls were silent, the linoleum gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She was at her desk, sipping from a mug that probably said something like, "World's okayest teacher." "Good morning, Mrs. Thorne," I said, placing the neatly stapled packet on her desk. "Here's my Antigone extra credit." She didn't look at the paper. She looked at me, a faint, unpleasant smile on her lips. "I'm sorry it's late. I can't accept it." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "Late? But you told me to turn it in Tuesday morning. I asked you 4 times last week." She feigned a look of mild confusion. "I don't recall that. The due date was clearly Monday." A cold fury began to replace my confusion. I reiterated our multiple conversations. She shook her head, her demeanor shifting from faux politeness to rigid dismissal. She then presented her justifications, a trifecta of absurdity that laid bare her vindictiveness. "First," she said, holding up a finger, "another student who was at the competition managed to turn it in on time. That student, I knew, lived directly across the street from the school and could simply walk over on Monday evening. I lived a 20-minute drive away and couldn't drive. Second," finger number 2 went up, "your mother is a teacher here. You could have sent it with her." This was perhaps the most galling point. I had been given explicit instructions to turn it in on Tuesday. Why would I involve my mother in a transaction that was supposed to be simple? Furthermore, my mother had her own classes, her own students, her own responsibilities. She was not my personal courier service. "Third," she concluded, the final finger rising in triumph, You could have done the work on Monday evening after you returned. That wouldn't be fair to the other students who did the work over the weekend. This was the accusation of laziness, her favorite theme. I was prepared for this. I opened my backpack, pulled out my laptop, and navigated to the documents properties for the essay. I turned the screen to face her, pointing to the last modified timestamp. Saturday, for 32 p.m. I said, my voice tight. I finished it on Saturday. I didn't touch it on Monday. She glanced at the screen and then back at me, her expression one of utter, implacable refusal. I'm not changing my mind. I do not accept late work. I was defeated. The $25 for the ticket, the hours of work, my mother's time and effort ferrying me around. All of it was wasted, sacrificed on the altar of her pettiness. When I told my mom what happened, her initial maternal sympathy quickly hardened into a deep, professional anger. She was livid not just as a parent but as a colleague who recognized this for what it was: an abuse of power. Mrs. Thorne's reputation as the school's toughest teacher was a badge she wore with immense pride. She often boasted that no student had ever earned an A on her comprehensive final exam. She mistook a torrent of busywork for rigor and willful obstruction for high standards. On the last day of class, during a vapid wrap-up session, she asked the room at large, "So, what's your biggest wish?" I didn't even think. The words shot out of me, fueled by a year's worth of repressed frustration. I wish for an A on the exam. The class tittered nervously. Mrs. Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah," she said, her eyes locking with mine. "And I wish for $1 million and not to have to deal with you anymore." The gauntlet had been thrown. The final exam was the last stand. The exam day arrived, thick with the tension of 100 teenagers facing their academic judgment. The test was 100 multiple-choice questions, followed by a 5-point bonus question that was typically a softball. What was your favorite part of this class? What was the most important thing you learned? We had 2 hours. To minimize disruption, a rule was in place. No one could leave until the first hour had elapsed. I blasted through the 100 questions in about 20 minutes. I knew the material cold. For the remaining 40 minutes of that mandatory first hour, I sat in the silent, tense room, and I planned my revenge. When the clock finally ticked down to the 60-minute mark, the proctor gave a nod. I was the only one of the 110 students taking the exam that day to stand up. I walked to the front, placed my exam booklet on the desk, and left. On exam days, teachers didn't proctor their own classes, so I had to wait in the main breezeway for my mom to finish her proctoring duty. I was sitting on a cold, metal bench, the adrenaline of my rebellion starting to ebb, when I saw her. Mrs. Thorne was striding toward me, my exam booklet clutched in her white-knuckled hand. Her face was pale, and her eyes were glistening with tears she was desperately trying to hold back. "Come with me," she choked out, her voice trembling. "Principal's office. Now." She didn't wait for a response, just turned on her heel and stalked away. My stomach plummeted. I walked slowly to the main office and took a seat in the waiting area. Our soccer coach, Mr. Davison, was there, filling out some paperwork. He looked up, surprised. "Well, look who it is. What did you do to get sent to the principal's office on exam day?" I'm shocked. Before I could answer, Mrs. Thorne returned, this time with my mom in tow. She had literally pulled my mother out of a testing room. My mom's face was a mask of controlled concern. The principal, a weary-looking man named Mr. Henderson, ushered us all into his office. What followed was a 45-minute torrent. Mrs. Thorne was the picture of hysterical victimhood, crying, her voice rising to a shriek at times, literally choking on her sobs as she recounted the vile, disrespectful, personal attack I had written on the bonus question. She slid the exam booklet across the principal's desk. Mr. Henderson put on his reading glasses and read my words. I watched his face, searching for a reaction, but he was a sphinx. He finished, took off his glasses, and laid them carefully on the desk. He then turned to me. "Would you like to explain this?" So I did. Calmly, methodically, I laid out the entire case. The targeted homework after away games, the nonsensical grading philosophy she had explicitly admitted to, the Antigone extra credit fiasco, detailing every one of her flimsy, disproven excuses. I spoke of the constant, grinding feeling of being unfairly targeted. My mom sat silently, her presence a quiet confirmation of my account, especially the parts she had witnessed firsthand. I was no longer a frustrated kid. I was a prosecutor presenting his closing argument. When I finished, there was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by Mrs. Thorne's sniffles. Mr. Henderson looked from my tear-streaked teacher to my resolute face, and then back to the exam booklet. He picked it up again, turned to the final page, and pointed to the bonus question. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice calm and utterly reasonable. "How much was this question worth?" She looked confused. 5 points. It's bonus. He nodded slowly. "So, the exam is out of 100 points, and this is an additional 5-point opportunity." "Yes." Mr. Henderson placed the booklet back on his desk and looked her directly in the eye. "Then just don't give him the bonus points." The simplicity of it was breathtaking. In that one quiet sentence, he dismissed her entire meltdown. He had seen through the drama to the core of the issue. A student had been rude on an optional question. The consequence was the forfeiture of those optional points. End of story. My exam score was a 98. I had missed 2 multiple-choice questions. Every other student in the grade received the 5 bonus points for their anodyne answers. The next highest score was an 81. I had not just beaten her infamous exam. I had annihilated it, even without the bonus. I thought the war was over. I was wrong. In the days before final grades were posted, I was meticulously tracking my average in a spreadsheet. My calculated average was a 95.2, a solid A. When the official grades were released, I had a 94.4, AB. I scoured my records and found it. A reading journal from the second week of school, a lifetime ago, had been mysteriously dropped from a 95 to an 85. I had no proof she had altered it. It was my word against hers, and the digital gradebook was now law. She had, in the most cowardly way imaginable, stolen the A she felt I didn't deserve. But fate, it seemed, had a sense of poetic justice. That summer, the school district, in a move toward standardization, switched to a 10-point grading scale. A 90 and above was now an A. My 94.4, the B she had fought so dirty to secure, was now officially an A. I had won. The fallout extended beyond my transcript. The administration, finally alerted to a pattern of behavior that went beyond tough grading, instituted new oversight for Mrs. Thorne. Her weekly lesson plans and homework assignments now had to be signed off by the department chair. She was mandated to accept assignments via email, closing the loophole she had used to torment me. The veil of hard teacher had been pierced, revealing the pettiness beneath. 2 years later, after a steady trickle of similar complaints from other students and parents became a flood, she was quietly fired. My experience wasn't the sole cause, but it was the crack in the dam that eventually gave way. I never felt a moment of guilt. She was a small, bitter person who wielded the authority of education not to build up, but to break down. She deserved every bit of the consequence that came her way. The memory of that year is still vivid, a masterclass in the subtle art of injustice and the quiet satisfaction of a battle, hard-fought and ultimately won. She was, without a doubt, the worst teacher I ever had, and the school was unequivocally better off without her.